Hello, this is Watch All About with another watch review, and in this review we're looking at a couple of brand new watches by Avi-8. This is the Centenary collection. Two of them, there's going to be four, but only two are being released first, and then the next two will be released in a couple of months. So as you can see, this is the box of one of them. I have two, the 1920s and the 1940s editions with me. The 1960s and the 1980s editions are the ones that will be released later in the year. So I'll show you the box of one of them. Obviously it's pretty big, as you can see. It's taking up pretty much all of the camera space. So we have this nice canvas effect to the case. If I take it out like so, pop it open, and here we have the 1940s edition. So they come with a little card, obviously the watch itself. Just take that out, move it to the side, and we have this neat kind of warranty card, which is metal, which is pretty cool. So basically the Centenary editions are an homage to the British RAF, the Royal Air Force, and how it has been together for 100 years now. So that is what this whole range is for. So I have these two versions with me. This is the 1920s edition, this is the 1940s edition. So each edition basically, all of the watches use the same case and the same dial layout, but they have ever so slight adjustments to the design to signify the decade that they represent. So obviously we have some different looks here. Mainly the 1920s has this more classic cathedral hands, and the font is definitely more of that era as well. Then the 1940s edition is probably more of the kind of bigger traditional kind of pilot watch that we all know very, very well. Obviously the 60s and the 80s will be even different yet to these two, to signify how the styles would have been during those decades. So let's talk specs then. All of the watches are going to be £249 or $345. The pre-order starts on the 7th of March, and if you do sign up before they are officially launched on the 22nd of March, this is 2018, you will get a slight discount on that. So £250. And that includes, they are fully automatic. They have a sapphire crystal as well, which is very good. So they are very reasonably priced, including, you get a really cool case as well. And we'll have a look at it in closer detail to see just the general build quality as well, to see if it is a good value proposition. So size-wise, as I mentioned before, size is exactly the same on both of them. 42mm in diameter. So if I just put this one on. So 42mm in diameter, a height of approximately 12mm, and then a lug-to-lug length of 48mm. So, these are pilots' watches, they are aviation-themed watches, so 42mm I think is spot on. 44mm is a bit risky because you tend to lose a lot of custom because of the sheer size of it. Many people aren't quite so happy with having a 44mm diameter watch strapped on their wrist. So 42mm I find to be absolutely perfect. Gives a good impression, nicely good ratio as well with the height as well. So it really does provide you with a decent looking watch, which provides a good amount of wrist presence. So if I just put the 1940s version on, you can see there on my approximately 7¼ inch wrist I have for reference. So in addition to these sizes, let's discuss weights. Interestingly, despite them being more or less exactly the same, the 1920s is heavier. So this one, 1920s, comes in at 81 grams, the 1940s comes in at 76 grams, so a variation of 5 grams there. And I think it's mainly because of the weight of strap. If you compare the two, the 1920s is a much thicker, heavier hide. So I think that's where the extra 5 grams comes from. Both have a water resistance of 50 meters or 5 atmospheres, so you're protected. You have a measure of protection against water resistance, but please don't go swimming with it. But if you do have an accident, you do have a measure of protection there. 22mm lug width as well, both tapering down ever so slightly to 20mm. So that's a nice, reasonable size strap for the size of case. That goes well together. You get a 2-year warranty as well, which is very good. And as I mentioned before, sapphire crystal on both of them. Avi-8 never usually used to include sapphire crystals, so I'm really pleased to see sapphire crystal included on these watches. When you're considering you're getting, Miyota movement as well, which I'll discuss in a second. The price is really spot on. I think they're doing a good job in realigning their prices, because they always used to be a little bit too much money and not have sapphire crystals. So I was always a little bit reluctant to sort of like approve them for the price. So now they're getting a lot more better on the price front. As I mentioned, Miyota movement 8218. Excuse me. So they all have this same custom rotor as well, which has the RAF roundel on this sort of skeletonized rotor. It's a fairly basic workhorse movement. It doesn't have a hacking seconds hand. That's probably the main thing you need to be aware of. So you will never be able to get it set perfectly to the second, because if you see here, usually when you pull out the crown to adjust the time, usually the second hand stops, and then you can set the time. As you can see here, it's not hacking, it's still running, so that's just something to be aware of. Let's just discuss the accuracy. So I've used the Lepsy watch scope on both of these two, and they're quite wildly different. The 1920's is quite a large plus 23.1 seconds out, whereas the 1940's is a much better plus 3.6 seconds out. Obviously, that's well within COSC specs, so that's quite incredible, quite amazing. But also the variation between the two is also quite a surprise. So hopefully, moving forward, all of them will get a decent measure of regulation, because we can, obviously it's proof there, 3.6 seconds on this one is proof that the capability of these movements, they can be regulated to within COSC specs. So let's hope moving forward all of them are. Okay, so let's just discuss in a little bit more detail the difference in the watches. So let's start off with the dial. As I mentioned before, they all have the same layout. So that is basically a small seconds hand at 4, 4.5, 5. That's because of the specific layout of the movement, the Miyota 8218. And then we have our date window located at 3 as well. We also have our logo at the top and Centenary at 9. So if I show you both of them, layouts, more or less exactly the same. So the key differences are the font used on the hour markers, the hands themselves, and just the colours also. They all have a sort of kind of matte finish to the dial, which is quite nice. I do like a bit of texture. So I think they've done a really good job here, making the watches look quite different, considering how similar they are. Obviously, the background colour makes a lot of difference, but also just the fonts used. We can see drastic difference in the two, and also the hands. They're the key things really to me that make all the difference. But I always find Avi-8s are really well designed, and it's no difference here. Just even though the numerals, the hour markers are so drastically different. Obviously these are double digit with leading zeros like 0, 5, 10, and these are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, blah 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 0. Despite them being so drastically different, they still look really, really good, and a simple change makes such a vast amount of difference. So they're doing a really good job so far on these two. Hopefully the 60s and the 80s Centenary versions will can follow suit. So everything's all very well manufactured on the dial. I mean, we'll get the macro lens on out in a few moments, but the hands are perfectly manufactured. Everything's pretty good. I found the loom, interestingly, on the 1920s to be a lot better than the 1940s, so I don't know if there's a slight difference with the loom used between the two. Also, interestingly, on this version, the 1940s, we have a same coloured date wheel, whereas we don't on the 1920s, we have just a white one. So if that's something that annoys you, then that's something to be aware of. Moving on to the case then. As I mentioned before, exactly the same case apart from really two adjustments. On the case back, we have this statement of which model it is. Obviously, that will vary depending on the model you have, 1920s, 1940s on these two. And then the only other difference is the crown. So here we have a classic kind of flat-topped onion crown that you see so often. One interesting thing is that this one isn't quite in the centre. So if I move it, you can see it ever so slightly wiggle. That's because it's not engraved bang on in the centre, which is quite a surprise, to be honest. A little bit of a shame as well. Hopefully that's just a one-off. I much prefer the crown on the 1920s edition, however. A really rounded, bulbous onion with really nice grip. And then we have sort of like a glass finish with the coloured RAF crown on the end. So I much prefer this crown. Really nicely manufactured, really easy to use. Both of them are easy to use, to be honest, as well, which is good. The case back. So as I mentioned before, we have the difference in model, but we just have other various specifics around the outside. The case is fully brushed apart from a couple of tiny accents. So we have this tiny bit of polished ridge on the corner of the lugs. And then we have a tiny amount here around the outside of the bezel. Very thin polished ring there. And I believe the same at the bottom of the case back as well. Tiny polished ridge there, which is nice. Obviously, the majority of it being brushed is good for the sake of longevity. It will certainly hold up the test of time better having a brushed case than polished. But the little flashes of reflection from the polished accents is a nice touch as well. Moving on to the strap then. I find they've done a good job in selecting the colours here. Certainly the lighter brown is a much more suitable match to the cream dial. Again, the darker brown, much more suitable match to the sort of charcoal grey of this model. So they've done a good job there. Interestingly, they're not the same straps as I mentioned before. They're one slightly thinner, one slightly thicker. So that's good to know that they've put the effort into the straps. You know, completely different straps. This one is, they're both really good quality, and I always find Avi-8 straps to be really good quality, to be honest. I do find the thinner one is ever so slightly more supple, but that's probably just because it's thinner. Either way, you're not going to have any issues with it. There's slight difference in finishing as well. This is certainly a much more matte, rustic feel to it, whereas this is a much more smoother, almost semi-matte kind of finish to it. They both have the same buckle as well, fully brushed with the Avi-8 logo engraved on the end. Okay, let's get the macro lens on and we'll look at it in much closer detail. So starting off with the dial on the 1920s edition, just change the time. So here we have the Avi-8 logo. You can see quite plainly the matte texture to the base of the dial there. We have our very nice raised numerals as well. You know, just really been impressed by the quality of the dial. Really nicely finished. And then the hands have a brushed finish to them as well to match the majority of the case. There we go. And just moving on to the 1940s edition. Let me just move the hands again on this one. So you can see here we have the same matte finish to it. It's not quite as obvious on this one though. Again, our raised numerals. And our print work, we have some crosshairs on this version as well, and then a slightly more plain small seconds subdial there. And there's our printed date wheel, and our raised hour markers like so as well. Moving on to the case then, here's the brushwork on the side, very nice and straightforward, can't complain. And then we have our lug with a polished corner, nicely done. And then our bezel with, again, a polished ring around the outside. Moving on to the crown. Here's the crown on the 1940s edition. Just an embossed roundel. And there's our grip. Very good grip, nice and easy to use. Nicely machined, apart from the alignment of the roundel itself, which is a bummer. And here's the 1920s edition, so a much more bulbous affair. You can see our coloured roundel on the end, which is really nice. Very lovely splash of colour there. Flipping it over to the case back. So here's our 1920s laser etched information, all the other information laser etched around the outside. Would have been much nicer if it was engraved, obviously, so that's a bit of a shame. And then moving on to the movement itself, I give the case back a wipe. Here's our customised rotor with our roundel, so that's a nice touch as well. If I spin that out of the way, you can see our movement itself. I found these to be really nice and clean actually as well. Miyotas tend to be a little bit grubby, but these have obviously been well looked after. And we've got some nice pearlage on the top of the bridges there. Moving on to the straps then. So we're still on the 1920s. This is the thicker, more rustic looking strap. Got some decent stitching down the side. And then this sort of very soft top hide, which is nice. And then looking at our buckle. So there's our brushed buckle with the logo engraved on the top. And then just flipping it over to the 1940s just to see this strap. Again, similar quality stitching and this slightly more shiny finish to the strap as well. Okay, so I've been really impressed by these two Avi-8s. I really do think in recent years they've really stepped up their game. As I mentioned before, they always used to have specs that weren't quite there to match the price. I'm pleased to say specs have gone up. Obviously, we've got sapphire crystals now, and the prices have gone down, because usually I would have expected Avi-8 to have priced these higher than the £250 RRP price. So I'm really happy that they've done a good job with tallying up the specs and the prices to keep it a decent, affordable watch. That people will happily pay RRP. I do find Avi-8s, you tend to be able to find them at slightly below RRP. So that's good news moving forward. But even so, at RRP, they're still a decent watch. So I've really enjoyed spending my time with them. I think they've done an excellent job. I look forward to seeing the other two models in the Centenary collection. Hopefully I get to review them as well. But what I've seen with these two, they've done a really good job of creating two very unique looking watches, but keeping changes to a minimal. Saying that the amount of changes they have made is still quite impressive. They've got custom hands on both of them. Although the dials are the same layout, they're still completely custom because of the hour markers and the hands, the difference in the subdial, the second subdial, for instance, as well. So obviously a lot of effort and a lot of work has gone into these two timepieces. Difference in straps as well. So they could have been a lot more lazier than they have been. So they've put a lot of effort into it, and I'm sure that when all four watches come out, there will be a style that will suit everyone. Obviously within the aviation quota. So really nice watches. Really impressed with them. Can't fault the quality. The only thing is the roundel on the end of the 1940s being slightly misaligned, and the 1920s movement could do with being a bit better regulated, but they're the only two things really. So yeah, pre-order 7th of March 2018, launch of 22nd of March. Sign up though, and you will get a discount on that. So these were the Avi-8 Centenary collection, and that's what you're all about. So just a cheeky little couple of wrist shots for you. This is the 1920s. And the 1940s.